Hey everyone, it's James Lindsay. You are listening to New Discourses Bullets, which is where I do a kind of a bullet point list of a single topic from woke Marxism so that we can understand it, so that we can defeat it and stop it. And a very common question that people wonder about, I think is very important to discuss. This dynamic is incredibly important to discuss with regard to communism, which is, why is communism so deadly? Is it just that it's a bunch of iron-fisted dictators who hate people and who want to kill people? Is it just that the point of communism is, in its own literal documentation, its own words, to destroy class enemies in order to establish the socialist state and the communist utopia that follows? What is it? And it turns out that, yeah, those things contribute. You do have murderous dictators that tend to run communist countries like Mao and Stalin. And yeah, the idea that they're going to literally that they're going to run a totalitarian dictatorship that's called the dictatorship of the proletariat in the name of the people, so that you can establish a fully operative socialist state that turns into communism in the end by having perfect belief, is part of it too. And the fact that they literally believe things like Mao said, power flows from the barrel of a gun, and they believe things like that they are entitled to have that kind of power over other people because, as Mao also said, to not have a correct political orientation is like not having a soul. In other words, for communists, if you're not a communist with them, if you're not working with them, then you're not even a person. You are, in some sense, an animal, or worse than, lower than an animal. You don't even have a soul, and you are completely expendable. As a matter of fact, you're probably worse if you're doing anything that resists the building of socialism or development of communism, because now you are an antagonist to the program. So yeah, it's really murderous there too. However, this is not actually the reason why communism is so deadly. Everywhere it goes, it's deadly. We're talking millions or tens of millions of people slaughtered, starved, frozen, you name it, diseased to death, and tortured to death in the attempt to re-educate them, all kinds of, worked to death in labor camps and in horrific working conditions. These are all features of every communist state that's ever attempted to exist in history, and yet even all of that awful brutality can't actually explain why they are so bad, why they're so deadly. Now, let's be very fair. The primary reason that the communist states are so deadly is not what I'm here to talk about, which is a very important concept. The primary reason that they're so deadly is because what I'm going to talk about leads to catastrophic failure. The catastrophic failure of the kind where nobody will speak up that things are going wrong, where even if they speak up, they can't, they get killed, or they get shut up, or they get silenced. And so what happens is massive disorganizational overreach happens, and people die by the millions. Take the example of the Great Leap Forward in China, which took place, depending on how we want to lay the dates down, we'll say from 1958 through 1962. Early in 1962, I think it was declared a disaster. And the primary death toll of this entire time, not that it was ever cushy to live through Mao's China, the primary death toll would have been in 1961, in the winter of 1960 into 61. And the death toll was unbelievable. Conservative estimates put it at 20 to 30 million people. This is just for this one event, not his entire reign in power. Other estimates put it as high as 55 to 60 million people, mostly died of starvation and exposure in the Great Leap Forward. The Great Leap Forward was a failure. What was going on? We're not going to get into the nitty-gritties of it, but basically China was going to do a Great Leap Forward on the industrial stage. It was going to overtake Great Britain in terms of its production so that it could look like a major world power, on paper at least, and it was going to do so by maximizing grain production, specifically wheat, and maximizing steel production. And it was going to do so at all costs, by any means, no matter what. And So to prove that they had all this excess grain, that first of all, they were all lying to each other about how much grain they were making and how much grain they could make. There were ridiculous quotas. The quotas kept getting jacked up. Everybody was pretending they'd be able to make anywhere between 2 and 10 times as much grain, 20 times as much grain as they could actually make, or steal in either case. And then they were exporting and exporting and exporting and exporting to show off how much grain they were growing. So the people are starving. There's not enough food for the people. What they do have is mismanaged, and it's going to rot. It's going bad. And nobody can speak up because they'll get railroaded out of town or killed or sent off to a re-education prison. And what's happening is the country is doing exactly the wrong thing that it should be doing when it's lurching into a human-induced famine, which is to export so much of its grain to show off how much grain it believes it's producing. So this is the kind of thing I'm talking about with the mismanagement. And then the large amount of death comes when suddenly there's no food, it's a harsh winter, and everybody dies because they're freezing to death and starving to death. But this isn't what I'm going to talk about. That's the kind of thing that results from the dynamic that makes communist countries literally national scale death cults that are going to end in this kind of a gigantic collapse. And communism is actually in some perverse way saved by these weird collapses, because if it's taken to its logical conclusion, which in practice it never is, communism would actually be continually murderous for exactly the reason I'm about to explain. And this is the answer to the question, why is communism such a deadly ideology? And the reason is that communist theory, according to communist theory, is never wrong. That's extraordinarily important to begin with. The communist theory must be correct. So therefore, when it doesn't work, when anything goes wrong, something must have been wrong with the implementation. And so what you're going to do is figure out who was implementing, who was doing the implementation of communism wrong, and you're going to have to replace or re-educate or murder those people for their failure. But even worse than that, as things go wrong and they start to pile up and more things go wrong, the communist state has only one explanation for why things are going wrong. It cannot be that, in fact, communism doesn't work. That can't be the explanation. So when they did the collectivization of the farmland, both in Soviet Union and then later in the People's Republic of China, massive amounts of unrest happened. Crop production fell through the floor. Of course, the next thing that happens is people starve to death. People destroyed their own equipment. People destroyed their own farmland. What was left over was misused and broken and badly treated because technically nobody owned it, or the party owned it all. And communism can't say that communism is what's wrong here. It can't say that the implementation of socialism was what's wrong here. It has to say that there are people who are subversives. That's what's wrong here. There are spies undercutting us. There are enemies hidden within everywhere. There are enemies outside that want to take them down, and there are enemies inside working against their interests. And there are class enemies that are still out there that the dictatorship of the proletariat was established to destroy. And the reason that communism is not working is because it hasn't sufficiently purged all of those bad elements, as they were sometimes called in Mao's China, hasn't sufficiently purged all of those bad elements that need to be taken out. So communism is so deadly because a very simple dynamic. It cannot admit that it is wrong. And so when it doesn't work, it is somebody's fault for not believing in communism hard enough. So then the job becomes find the people who don't believe in communism hard enough. And the thing is, by the time you get to 1957, 1958 in Mao's China, he took over in 1949, so we're talking 7-8 years into this project. By the time you get there aren't a whole lot of people left in the country who are going to open their mouths and say communism sucks, socialism doesn't work. And this is especially because Mao had just done what was originally called the 100 Flowers campaign, in which he said, let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools of thought contend. So the idea was we're going to have free speech, we're going to tell the government what it's doing wrong so we can make socialism socialism even better, and we can talk about how great socialism is. And in 4 months, it got so out of hand that they almost lost control of the country. There was that's how powerful free speech is, by the way, that within 4 months, they almost lost control of their dictatorship in their country, and they almost had a revolution that would have ended communism. But instead, Mao, being very savvy, turned it into what he called an anti-rightist campaign. And so he claimed that the purpose was not to push free speech, which it was, but the real purpose was to get the snakes to come out of their holes. And so then he went around and killed everybody who spoke up and revealed themselves to be a class enemy or a party enemy. And so nobody would speak up. So when you get far into a communist situation, nobody is outwardly showing that they're a class enemy. So you have to just go find them. So what Mao did was he would set quotas. I don't care, go to the entire province, whichever one, whichever province, Guangzhou, it doesn't matter, go to whatever province, and what you're going to do is you're going to kill 1 out of 1,000, you're going to take 2 more out of 1,000 and send them to labor camp, you're going to take 3 more out of 1,000 and put them in prison. And this is just, it didn't matter what people were doing right or wrong. And what this causes is this massive attempt to find all of the bad guys, all of the class enemies. And what that causes in the population is everybody to say, it's my neighbor, it's not me. It's my father, it's not me. So that the quota can get fulfilled by other people and you can save your own neck. And that is why communism is actually so deadly. And the reason that happens is because the communists cannot admit that the communists are wrong. Look in the wake of the 2024 election at how the Democrats are coming out and doubling down on almost everything that lost them the election. It's the same mechanism. They cannot admit that they were wrong. And so rather than admit that they were wrong in the way they approached a lot of things, they're now calling Latinos, who voted in larger numbers than expected for Trump, they're now calling Latinos white supremacists. They don't have any other thing to do but apply more. If they had the power of Mao or Stalin or Lenin, you would see a march into Latino communities and a purge of a few out of 1,000, and however many others kill each other or get killed in the process, whatever. And that's because their only explanation is somebody wasn't communist enough. And that right there is why communism is so damn deadly, because downstream from that is nobody telling you that your export program is a really bad idea and that the people are starving, and everywhere you go in the country people are starving, and that they're not producing steel, they're producing garbage, and that all of the quotas that they're telling you, all of the targets that they're selling you are fake, and that all of this is going to collapse and fall apart because nobody will say it because they know if they do they're going to lose their heads. That is downstream from communism is never wrong. The party is always right. And so the totalitarian system of communism is so deadly simply because communism believes that communism is never wrong. And therefore it must be hidden enemies that have to be rooted out and found and re-educated or destroyed that cause their failures. They can never accept their blame. They only externalize blame. So remember the dynamic of communism is always this, and it's a power grab for them. Step one is that they implement some policy or whatever plan, and then it fails. It fails miserably. The next step is that they externalize the blame. The blame lands on their class enemies. So there are somewhere hidden counter-revolutionaries or bourgeois elements or racists or transphobes or whatever it is, and you externalize the blame. All the Latinos are white supremacists now, Dios mío or whatever. And then after you externalize the blame, you use that environment to concentrate more power for the communists, and then they use that to propose a new communist policy that will fail, that they then externalize blame, that they will then use that externalized blame and hatred for their class enemies to concentrate more of their power. And that right there is a downward spiral that ends up killing 50 million people in a gigantic economic collapse eventually, like the Great Leap Forward. So this is why communism is so dangerous and so deadly. It's operating exactly, not just like a cult, but like a death cult. It is operating as a cult in that it is never wrong. And always the reason that it's not succeeding in its crackpot goals is because somebody out there isn't doing their part well enough. And those people have to be found and destroyed. So bear that in mind. Anytime one of these young people especially asks you why communism is so bad, what's so bad about socialism, what's so bad about communism, and you feel tempted to give some explanation about taxes or human motivation, you don't even have to. Communism is so bad because communism can never be wrong in its own eyes and will therefore kill everybody that it can get a hold of in order to prove that it's right.